Welcome to the Continuous Delivery Podcast. My name is Zarar.
I'm Csaba.
And I'm Cheezy.
And tonight we have a Kanban master, Fernando Cuenca, who is the Kanban coach that is going to educate us on all the things we're doing wrong with Kanban and set us right on our path. Because all of us have teams we've worked with and we've coached them to go on Kanban and promised all these things. And we've been doing it all wrong, guys. But today it's good news. We're going to get corrected and we're going to learn something out of this next 30 to 40 minutes. Fernando, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Zarar, and hello, everyone. Happy to be here.
Okay, let's start off. I'll just start off with a personal thing. So I'm currently in an engagement where I sort of inherited a few Scrum teams, and I noticed the typical anti-patterns of people not meeting their sprint commitments, things spilling over, and the team sort of being okay with it. It's sort of been normalized that, hey, it's just 40% of stuff just moves over to the next sprint. That's just the thing we do now. And just to break out of that pattern and knowing what I know about flow, so I introduced Kanban there with the goal that people essentially have more focus on the current work that they are doing, basically to reduce work in process, because we all know the less things you work on, the faster you deliver. So that was sort of the main goal. Talk to us, lead us off with somebody who's working with Scrum teams and is experiencing some of the same things that I mentioned with lack of sprint commitment and spillover and high whip, and sort of talk to us. What is the motivation for a team like that to switch over to Kanban? What does Kanban bring that can solve some of their present issues with flow or with high whip? Just give us like a overview before we dive into more details.
Right. Okay. So the first thing I would start with is to saying that there isn't really motivation to switch to Kanban. So the Kanban proposition is never a switch, right? So Kanban is not a new process you use to change the other process you have. It's a lens that you use to understand your current process, and based on that, make sense of what's happening and how, in which ways, whatever is that happening is not serving your needs, and from there you change, right? So my way to deal with this situation is not approach it as a switch to Kanban, but use Kanban to understand why what you're seeing is happening and why it's negatively affecting your results, and from there decide what to do, right? Now, so you said, for example, that the teams are working and they can't meet their commitments. Well, okay, so one of the first things we learn to see with Kanban is that work flows, and there is some natural cadence to that flow. So what are the things that are causing things not to fit within the sprint, for example? Is it there are lots of delays, for example? It could be lots of whip. So this is where Kanban start helping you with bringing in some models. One of them has to do with models for flow, right? So we know that the more things we have in process, the more things will take, because it will start interfering with each other, right? Because you will have to multitask a lot. So Kanban will start giving you the ideas of what things to look at. That could be one, but it's not the only one. The other may be just a matter of having lots of delays. The other may be that you're having lots of variability, for example, in the way you're cutting your work items. We normally call story size. Are your stories too big? And that's the reason they don't fit. Because, for example, you may be just having too much work that just doesn't fit once it starts expanding with work that you discover or dependencies that you introduce or delays that are caused by other pieces of work. So that would be my first starting points. Let's try to understand flow first. Let's try to understand what are the reasons for the variability you're seeing, and from there you move on. Now, over time, what will start happening is that as you start applying the Kanban way of seeing work and you start introducing countermeasures to that, you tend to move away from processes that are based on strict time boxes, right? But this is not just because Kanban says don't apply time boxes. It's because Kanban tells you or helps you see how work flows more naturally, how you need to deal with dependencies and multitasking. And the result is that the reality is that in many environments, the time box doesn't really help you. Right? Mm-hmm. So Scrum is meant to be applied to a context where work fits naturally in time boxes, where those time boxes have some sort of meaning to the business, right? Scrum also assumes, for example, that the arrival of work and the delivery of work, those two cadences are synchronized, right? Well, in many business environments, that assumption doesn't really hold, right? So Kanban helps you see things like that. And once you start seeing, you can start removing many of these assumptions, and you tend to move away from time-boxed processes and moving more into continuous flow, where work essentially arrives at some cadence, or you let it in at some cadence. It takes whatever it takes, and then you monitor the variation of that just to make sure it fits within some boundaries that you define. So the reason in Scrum we want things to fit within the sprint, as you all know, is because we don't want work to continue going and going and going and going and going and going. So it forces us to finish things and get a cadence of feedback, right? Well, that the cadence, Kanban takes the cadence of feedback, the concept of the feedback cadence, but it doesn't constrain it to a fixed feedback cadence that needs to fit in your 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever it is.
So yeah, I can go. First of all, Zarar, I didn't even know sprint commitments was still a thing. I thought that was like ancient history. I don't think, I don't know, but.
Yeah, and here is another thing that Kanban can help you with. So when we say sprint commitment, what kind of commitment is that? So Kanban understands commitment as a promise we made to a customer to deliver some sort of value at some point, right?
Yeah. So I really like what you said, Fernando, about how, using Kanban and layering it over what you're doing right now to help you see what you can remove, and part of the overlap with continuous delivery is that continuous delivery often is about removing things that are high risk or things that don't add value, and those of us, actually us here who have worked in that way, what we've seen is that we've naturally moved more and more toward a Kanban flow, and along the way, getting rid of things like sprint commitments, getting rid of things like, even the sprint boundaries, getting rid of things like, big grooming sessions, release planning, all of these things. So I really like that. How would you determine what are the things to remove? I mean, again, just to continue down this this path. So we've layered Kanban over, but what heuristics, I guess, would we use to learn, hey, here's something that's causing me problems. I need to remove it, or I need to find a different way to do this thing.
So in Kanban, we tend to first we tend to rely on metrics and quantitative management, and in particular, we like to look at things like lead times, cycle time. So we could go into that tangent. There is a difference between those, but how long something takes. So, and the reason that metric is so key is that because if you start understanding what causes lead time to be the way it is, that starts answering Cheezy's question, right? Because everything is about things taking some amount of time that for someone is unreasonable or too risky, or in general terms, unfit for some purpose, right? Now, in that timeline, so you say, well, things take anywhere between, let's say, 1 day and 15 days. But there is, in someone's heads, there is a number that tells you how long things are adequate. So 1 perhaps is too fast, 15 is too long. We would like things to be around 5 for whatever reason. And the reason can be as varied as it needs to fit in the sprint, or we promised the customer that time, or that is how frequently we would like something to be, whatever the number is. So that starts partitioning your lead time distribution, so that this variety of lead times that you observe into 2 sections, the lead times that are adequate or fit for your purpose and the ones that are not, right? So if you start understanding which of those items fall in your unfit part of the lead time distribution, and you start understanding the reasons, that starts telling you why you need to get rid of those things. And it could be process parts. So you said, for example, we started getting rid of things like grooming. Well, maybe that's a process step or a process. It's a part of your process that you realize is not helping, or the result of that is a long lead times, right? So that's how you decide that in this context, this practice needs to go away. You may also find that, for example, has nothing to do with that, and it has to do with, the way we do grooming is that we tend to detect our dependencies with that very, very strange database group we have in the back end only too late, right? We don't discover them enough. So actually, we need to do more of that type of grooming rather than other type of grooming, right? And the result is you end up eliminating some sort of delay, and your items start moving more into the fitter part of the deep time distribution curve, not the unfit. And it could be process steps that you remove or add, or it could be dependencies that you remove or add. It can drive many other decisions. So in Agile, I think we ended up making lots of recommendations to people that are actually rooted in this, but then we forgot about that part of the conversation. So why do we talk about, for example, cross-functional teams, right? Well, because we want to eliminate dependencies. Why? Because dependencies introduce delay, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So,
yeah.
So, Fernando, you were talking about, and actually also Zarar mentioned his team thinking about switching to Kanban, and you mentioned one of the big factors is dependencies, right?
mm-hmm.
And we all worked at very, very large organizations where a single team can very, very rarely deliver something
Mm-hmm.
by themselves, right? So often what we observe that the most common reason why a team cannot finish something within their sprint because of these dependencies, because of these
Mm-hmm.
blockers, because of these external factors, right? And there is always this situation where, okay, now we are kind of suspending this kind of work. So now we're picking up something because we don't want to be idle, right, about this utilization kind of pressure. And now the whip starts going up,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what would be your advice, given that the realities of some of these large organizations where some of these dependencies, unfortunately, is very, very rarely in the team's control, and often not even their leaders can have big influence on those dependencies. Again, I'm just telling the reality that's most likely happens in these large organizations. So what's your advice in this case? How to handle this whip, how to handle this switch, how to like anything around this kind of unmovable dependency, and then anything in this vicinity?
Yeah. So you're right. The unfortunate reality for most organizations we work with is that they have this wave of dependencies that is usually untouchable. Sometimes it's there for a reason, sometimes it's not, right? So it's in cases where the dependencies are there because you need to keep some departments apart for regulatory reasons, for example. So, and that may be a good reason for having it, but many in other cases no. But regardless, so I think that the advice I usually give to managers when they're having this question is start by understanding that. So the problem of dependencies is not a problem of carefully scheduling and carefully planning and orchestrating work. It's a problem of collaboration, right? So you have a group that depends on another group. And if these two groups don't talk to each other and don't have an interface that is reliable enough, the problem is not going to go away. So that splits, in my mind, the problem in two different camps. So you either live in a world where, let's say you have these two groups that have a dependency and their managers want to cooperate and they want to do something about it. That's problem A, let's call it. And there are some solutions for that can go from things like bringing the groups closer, making them more cross-functional and all that. So even if you don't remove the dependency, you may bring them together to work better, to exchange their work, to allocate capacity and things like that. So that would be a high maturity type of situation. Okay. Most of the cases we don't see that, right? We see cases that groups that actually have trouble collaborating. So that puts us in camp B. So in camp B, essentially what you need to do is I'm standing here and I know I'm dealing with that group that is going to be unreliable, unresponsive, late. And again, it's not. I'm not saying that from a position of blaming them. There may be good reasons for that. There may be things that are outside their control. So, but whatever the case is, they end up being slow and unreliable from my perspective. So the Kanban approach to that is to say, well, we need to just be careful to anticipate that dependency as much as we can, so we can hit it when they may be ready and once we are ready. So we are not committing. So the worst thing you want to do is to start committing yourself to something that will be immediately delayed because it's blocked right away off the gate. Right? So unfortunately, what that usually means is that you need to do more upfront analysis of the work before commitment. Right? So you need to detect which work will likely hit the dependency, so you can decide to delay the commitment as much as possible, or to get some sort of commitment from the other side. So you negotiate the commitment first before you commit. So just to give you an example of that, I used to work with a team at an organization once that had kind of by accidents, they realize that, the development team over here needs to get copy from marketing over there, right? And they normally, they figured by experience that usually for whatever change they needed, it would take 15 days just to get the change across, right? So what they ended up doing? They ended up essentially grooming here the things that they knew they need to do 15 days after, and getting engagement with marketing 15 days in advance. That way they got their lead times much more tightly tied, right? And I see Cheezy is shaking his head. It is crazy. I will agree, but you work with the context you have, right? So
that's right.
Under that situation where you have another department that doesn't want to change their ways and there isn't much you can do, the only thing you can do is to act defensively, right? But again, the Kanban approach is you accept your reality as it is today. You try to make sense of it, get to a position that gets you in a better state, and see if you can use that to negotiate a better step after, right? So a better solution would be to get them closer, to make it maybe perhaps somebody from marketing in your team just to have the dependency, or to remove the need for that approval or that particular type of work. But if you cannot do that, the solution in this case would be to anticipate your dependencies. You start looking downstream from you, try to anticipate, figure out in your process, where do you find that your dependencies occur? Oh, here's another thing that this team did. Because you can look at your backlog. You have a bunch of stories you need to work on. And they knew by looking at the stories, just doing a quick, sometimes it was in the name, sometimes it was in the description of the story. So teams get the sense. You can anticipate whether you're going to hit the dependency or not. You know if this is going to require marketing copy or not. So that can be another decision criteria you make when you commit. So the stories that don't require that dependency, they just flow through and they just get done. They get done quickly. The others are the ones that require more, bureaucracy, right? More grooming, more detailed work. So you start segmenting your backlog. You start not treating everything the same, because not everything follows the same rules, right? So,
yeah, if you don't mind, Csaba, also Kanban can help us drive through those challenges that you just described. For example, where we talked about you have these dependencies and such. Well, guess what? You're going to start having really long cycle times then with your stories, and that's going to be a problem, right? Your WIP is going to go up, and those are the signals. I think that's kind of what Fernando introduced here, is that you layer this over and they give us the signals to inspect and adapt if you're in like a Scrum area, because the truth is there are things that we can do to decouple those developments. Right. Things like we can write contract tests, and that now we have an agreement on what can be. We have things like feature toggles. So, for example, I can continue to develop, build out my mocks, build out my fakes, even deploy and have it ready, pushed out without the dependency being quite ready yet. So, so again, the trigger is, wow, we see that our cycle time's going up because I get things that are stuck. But then as continuous delivery folks, we have to not just accept that and say, okay, well, that's the way things are. But instead, we have to use the skills and the technologies that we know and that we have to help us drive past that. Feature toggles are your friend in this case.
Yeah, just to add to what Cheezy was saying, I think the more general term I would use in the Kanban perspective for that is deferral of commitment, right? So you defer the commitment to, for example, having something available in production. For example, you put it behind a feature toggle, so it's there. So you defer the commitment to put this out until the other part is ready, right? So which means that there is some work that is trailing behind, but you defer that part, you let the other flow. So. And now, if you live in the other world, because at the beginning I mentioned like two worlds, right? The higher maturity world, where you have the two groups, cooperating. So if you live in that world, well, that opens a whole set of other techniques, because essentially what it means is that even if you need to get the two groups separate and with work flowing in between, Kanban has things like something called there is a scheduling technique called, the name escapes me now. It has to do with capacity allocation, right? So you essentially can allocate capacity on the dependency service, and you can offer guarantees of delivery, for example. You can say, well, for this type of work, I can guarantee you delivery within this time frame, but for this one, it's going to take longer, or things like that. So there are more advanced techniques, but they require higher maturity in the organization and higher capability to actually implement it.
So you mentioned, I think what I took out of that is that Kanban is great at sort of exposing your process, or getting you more intimately aware of your process so that you can actually do something about it. So a lot of the things that might be hidden in other frameworks, Kanban makes it a point to make them more explicit. And one of the things that I kind of want to ask you about is policies, because I found, and maybe you can correct me, is that your board, your flow is only as good as the policies that are on it. If you have poor policies and you don't know what each stage means, you're not going to get the benefits that you talked about. And at the same time, the second part of policies is that there needs to be sort of a strong assessment of what your work item types are, because as you said a few times, not everything has the same flow. Even though the board might have like 6 columns, not every item maybe applies to those 6 columns. So can you just talk a little bit about some techniques on that teams can use to both identify what good policies look like, or maybe you can talk about what bad policies look like, and the inverse would be true.
Right.
And then maybe some commentary on how do you determine what the work item types are? And you can keep your answer more general or specific. I'll leave it to you. So
I love that topic because you see, it's very common that we walk into teams that they just have stories. Everything is a story. So what do you work on? Stories. Perhaps stories and bugs, and that's it. But the reality is that the work we do tends to be very heterogeneous. It has different needs. Serves different people. So I think you hit on the 2 important things: is work item type identification first. So let's accept that the work we do is very heterogeneous. So you may have, even if you just develop features, well, some of these features are about, enhancing the products and enhancements. Some of these are things that support the business. Some of them may be regulatory requirements. So I would start with that. So it's having a richer model to model the work. Now, in terms of how to find those, the general comment, try to be a little bit more richer in your catalog, but whenever possible, try to favor those work item types that are customer recognizable. Right. So a type of work should be something you can discuss with your customers, something they understand, something they can help you prioritize, they can help you make trade-offs on, right? So you're going to walk into a grooming conversation or a refinement about a specific item, and you need to make trade-off decisions. You want to have that conversation with your customer. That can happen if the type of work is completely unknown to them. And that tends to happen when you use things that are very internally focused, like technical stories or database stories, or God forbid, things like testing stories, like very specific, process-specific stories, right? So the more internally facing the items are, the less customer recognizable tend to be, which means the customers just tune off, right? They just go away. So define your customers in your items in customer terms. What are the terminology they use, right? So that would be the first. And then there is a whole conversation about granularity. So we tend to favor things that are smaller. Now, once you have that, start by recognizing that each of those will most likely have a different process. They will not follow the same steps. So you may have, as you said, 6 columns in the board, but you need to map the workflow for each of these work types. So if you're dealing with, for example, regulatory work, what is the workflow? They usually arrive, and it means that they are probably committed right off the bat because you don't have a saying on that. And there is usually a deadline, so it means there is a date, and there's going to be some sort of work that needs to be done, and maybe approvals. That may be very different from feature development, right? Feature development may be more discretionary. There may be more conversations about value, more conversations about experiments, or product fit. It may be smaller or bigger or whatever it is. So for each of them, the columns are likely to be different. So once you have identified the overall workflow, so what are different activities are required to deliver something, then the policies part that you mentioned comes in. So if something lands in the grooming column. What does it mean? And that's part of the agreements we do with teams in general when we have definitions of done and definitions of ready. So a good one would make easy for the team to just make their own decisions. So a collection of policies essentially allows teams to operate independently. So if they can just look at the list and know exactly what are the process steps we follow here. In some cases, it means we need to make sure these documents are done, for example, or to make sure these process steps are done. The other thing I would recommend is that we spread them across the workflow. So it's very common, especially for Scrum teams, to have definitions of done, and they tend to apply at the end of the workflow. They say, well, at the end of the sprint, we need all this done. But sometimes all these elements apply at different steps, and there isn't an agreement of where they should be done, right? Mm-hmm. So we're going to have some sort of review with the customer or with the business about some feature we're just finished. So are we supposed to check in the code and make sure everything integrates before or after that, right? So we know it should be done at the end, but when do we do that? Do we have even an agreement? I have seen teams where half of the team thinks that it's okay to just demonstrate to the client things that is just on their machines. The other team thinks that or understands that no, we should be checked in and it should be integrated into the master branch and it should pass all the tests before we do any other demonstration or something like that. So spread out your policies, your definition of done across multiple steps in the workflow, so everybody's in agreement to where they fall. Right? And the other thing perhaps is let's remember transition policies is only one type of policies. So there are more global policies, like especially in technical teams, right? We never use this particular design pattern here because it doesn't work, right? So this is a more general policy. It could be about, I don't know, we don't eat fish in the office and heat in the microwave, something like that.
And just one comment on that, on the policies aspect of it. It's that we all want to create self-organizing teams which sort of operate on their own, and I found that having good policies also encourages that, because as a Scrum Master or a project manager who's trying to lead a team, if you have good policies, you can always point to the policies and say, hey, we all agreed to this. We're not following it now anymore. So it becomes less about what the Scrum Master wants or what the PM wants, and more about what we all agreed to at specific state, the transitional policies that you talked about. So the importance of policies, of course, is the flow of work. But I think it plays a tremendous role in creating self-organizing teams, as long as they understand the policies and actually buy into it.
Yeah, there is actually a very counterintuitive thing around policies. So very clearly defined policies actually create more autonomy. They don't restrict autonomy, right? Because if I know which are the rules, obviously it depends on how tight the policies are, right? So as a manager, I could design policies that are so tight that don't leave room for breathing to anyone, right? But even then, it means that within that very tightly contained boundary, I have full autonomy. It makes clear what my autonomy is. And the key really for self-organizing teams, I found, is you start with some level of policies where everybody knows how to play. And over time, you can start expanding and relaxing them because people start getting the bigger principles around them. So, so my main advice for managers in general is define your policies carefully, because that if you want autonomy, start with having clearly defined boundaries and expand them over time.
When we talk about policies, I don't think we can separate from WIP limits and WIP in general.
Yeah, WIP limits is a form of policy. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And what I found is like if you go back to the Scrum analogy, right? So what Scrum does. Scrum's WIP limit is the time limit, right? And you whatever is your sprint commitment, that's your kind of what Scrum's way of dealing with work in progress limitations, right? While in Kanban we have explicitly on a certain stage or certain step we do certain amount of we take on a certain amount of work. Now what I experienced before that these are violated sometimes right away or very often, or like it's one of those very common I don't want to say mistakes, but one very common behaviors how people treat WIP limits in general. Do you have any advice on how to manage WIP limit, because it's always a very tricky one, right? Because you don't want to have a very like strict and say, no, you can never violate. It doesn't matter. It's like, even if the CEO calls, you don't violate this way, or versus just don't care at all. These are kind of probably the two extremes, right? On WIP limit. How do you navigate this? What do you do when you violate? Like just if you can talk a little bit through
so
this.
several things about WIP limits. It's a very common topic. One, if you're just starting with Kanban, WIP limits is not the first thing I would suggest you start with, precisely because of what you're saying, right? So actually, it requires a higher maturity level for the organization to be able to actually respect limits, right? Now, that said, the Kanban principle is normally known as limit WIP, but the way I think we probably should talk about it is manage WIP. So the problem is not limiting WIP, it's managing and keeping it within some boundaries that actually serve you in some way, right? When WIP goes completely unmanaged and uncontrolled, that's when you have problems. Now, one way of doing that is to put a top limit and say the number won't go higher than that. But the reality is that WIP will fluctuate between in a band, right? So there is an amount of WIP that if you go below, it leads to starvation. So the teams eventually have nothing to do, right? But if it goes too high, it leads to slowdown and stall, right? So you need to the practice is really about managing WIP in that band. So my colleague Alexis Zeklov always says you don't limit WIP with WIP limits, right? So it's not a number you write on a board. So it's a number you keep in your mind and you know in which band it needs to be. And the other thing is, as you pointed out, I think it was David Anderson who said at some point that WIP management really is a leadership problem. It's not a technical problem. So it's very easy to walk up to a board and just put a number, right? The problem is that it's going to be violated. Then what happens then? So as a coach, really what I need to do is see what's the reaction of managers. And I'm using managers in the widest possible sense. So what's your reaction of your Scrum Master? What's your reaction of your team lead? What's your reaction of your director, whatever the person in a position of authority is? What is these people's reaction when they see the number violated? Is it just whipping people and just saying you shouldn't and just wag the finger, which we know does nothing, or there is something else? Because usually the answer is something else. So if you see that the number is violated, there is something else that happens. For example, the culture you're in may not may actually treat very badly to people who are seen to be idle. So people are in that context are not going to say, well, no, I can't do anything because my WIP limit doesn't let me. Mm-hmm. So you have cultural pressure to violate the limit, right?
So I think, though, that statement that you just made shows a bad culture as well. Mm-hmm. Well, I've got nothing to do because my WIP limit, because in a highly collaborative environment, which is what we hope to achieve in software development, I think the cultural aspect is really important, like you just said, Fernando, but the culture needs to be one that hey, if I have finished the thing that I was working on, the next step should not be to start something new.
Something new, right?
And that's a culture shift as well. But the next step should be to look and see where I can add the most value. Mm-hmm. Looking at the board, understanding how things are moving across the board, and so forth and so on. So I think it's very cultural, but I think the best, in my opinion, the best way to teach a team to limit WIP is not to make them feel guilty whenever they hit the WIP, but to show them a better way to work.
Yeah.
And so that to me is fundamental. That I know we've said this many, many times, but stop starting and start finishing, and that's kind of the goal here. So
but I think you hit it in the nail. So the problem is collaboration, right? So a WIP limit being violated may be the sign that you still don't have collaboration as a value. Mm-hmm. Right? So maybe before working on limiting WIP, you need to work on collaboration first, right? Mm-hmm. So encouraging people to work to help each other. As you just said, I've just finished something. Don't run to the backlog to find the next item. Look at your teammate if there is a need for help there. So and I think that's the part that needs to be understood. So we won't encourage, or we won't have WIP control just by adding numbers or trying to enforce them. It's by generating a collaborative environment. Eventually, people need to start valuing this idea of stop stop starting, start finishing.
Mhm.
Well, that also means we need to value flow. So we need to work on those values first as a way to say, well, in order to get that, better flowing, we have to have WIP limits. But it's kind of like the afterthought, right?
Yeah,
So-
absolutely. So back a long time ago, whenever we were trying to introduce, lean concepts, and I'm talking 15 plus years ago,
Mhm.
one of the things that we used to try to do whenever we were just starting is count the number of developers on the team
Mhm.
and say the start is that's how many you're allowed on the board, not a column, but that's how many you're allowed on the board. And so let's say that there's 6
Yeah.
developers on the team. From the time that we start until dawn, you're only allowed to have 6 things on the board.
Mhm.
And now we often see, unfortunately, in teams that are a little bit more dysfunctional, is they'll maybe have 6 items just on the writing code column, whatever that is, and more in other columns and so forth. But
There are different heuristics, so that's one. The other is just look at the total number you have currently and try to use that as a total number. So
Mhm.
that would be another one. Now, the thing is, in environments where they are not ready for this yet, perhaps there is another position that's under that, which is instead of trying to limit the number of tickets on the board, you try to limit the number of tickets per person. So move to a personal WIP limit rather than a board WIP limit. Right, so it's like a initial step. You say, well, we can have whatever number we have because there may be the pressure to start work. I don't want to be seen idle, whatever it is. But then you say, well, can we agree that every person shouldn't have more than 3? Right?
What would make an organization not ready for it? Because you said maybe an organization's not ready for that. Then we go down to you could have no more than 13 per person, or I don't know, something. But why would an organization not be ready to try that?
Well, I think you said it earlier. It's because they still don't have the value of collaboration, the value of flow. So they are still not valuing those things, which is what having a WIP limit will eventually enable. So we put a WIP limit in place so that we are not overwhelmed, so that things flow. But if I don't value flow, then that's kind of mute. And the thing is, for the WIP limit to work, we need to have an environment where we value helping each other so that we just keep things moving and flowing. If we don't have that tends to encourage more individualistic behavior, for example. So work on that first and try to just use once you have the value of collaboration, then you can say, well, if we also want flow, WIP limits is a way to do that. Now, I worked with a team once where we had this conversation about WIP limits. Of course, it wouldn't work because there were other pressures that wouldn't allow WIP limits to work at the team level or at the board level. But they easily bought into the notion of having some sort of personal limit, right? So what was interesting about that is that if you look at the CFD of that team, they started with uncontrolled WIP, and after a while, it was a CFD that was pretty much was showing flow. The WIP level was high in general, which meant that their lead times were perhaps too high, but at least it was contained, right? So the difference between a personal WIP limit and a team WIP limit or a board WIP limit is what type of overloading it helps you with, right? So personal WIP limits will help you with personal overloading. So I say, well, my top multitasking is going to be 3 things or 2 things or whatever it is, and you can work that down. If you start applying a team level WIP limit, that moves the overload control to the team level, right? And if you move that to a workflow, because you can also have WIP limits in end-to-end value streams, right? So then you're preventing overload in value streams, which could contain multiple teams and multiple groups of people. So WIP limits at different levels will serve different purposes. They are always about controlling overload. The question is whose overload we're controlling, or we're trying to limit, right? And start with people. If the people are the focal point initially, we'll work with that. Work your way up.
So let's talk a little bit about metrics. I think I've been using Actionable Agile in Jira lately, which is turning out to be one of the better plugins out there.
Yeah.
I've lately sort of been diving into the aging charts a lot because I find them to be extremely practical. So whereas throughput is sort of telling you how you performed in the past, and cycle time is telling you like how fast you've been delivering. I find the aging chart, the aging analysis sort of give you a very good snapshot of how things currently stand and what requires attention. And I'm actually flirting with the idea of like having the aging chart sort of be almost your primary artifact in your daily stand-up or daily scrum, because it sort of like kind of screams where attention should be given right away because of the age of the item. So aging is one metric that I have found extremely valuable.
Yeah.
Can you maybe talk about if you're a scrum master or somebody running a team, a PM, what metrics should you be paying attention to? And it's a two-part question. One is, what metrics should you be paying attention to when you are trying to communicate with a team about where things can be improved? And if you have external stakeholders who you maybe want to report to in terms of like what you accomplished, are there any kind of external facing metrics that you can talk about? So both internal team level metrics like aging, but also kind of like what do stakeholders need to know any metrics that might be able to help them?
Yes with an if, no with a but. So yes. So let's take it one at a time. So team level. So you're the Scrum Master. By all means, look at aging. So the Kanban advice is move away from the 3 questions in your stand-up. Nobody really cares what you did yesterday. What are you planning to do today? Focus on the work, not the people, right? So switch the conversation around, so you're not talking about what people did. Talk about what work did. Did work move or didn't move? Because that will start instilling the value flow, right? And aging is a big component of changing that conversation, right? So when you walk your board in a stand-up that is informed by Kanban, usually you start, as you know, from the right side and you move to the left. You try to see what is the word that is getting close to that, and then the word that is progressively older than that. And I usually streamline the meeting even more, saying, well, let's not even talk about each item. Let's talk about them in order of importance. First, do you have any expedites that need attention? If not, is there anything that is blocked, that is not moving? Let's talk about that. And the third step is, okay, let's look at aging. So which are the items that are over some aging? And once you get proficient enough, you can have like thresholds. For example, something that has, let's say you're running a sprint of 2 weeks. Well, something that has been on the board for, let's say, 3 or 4 days, that's probably fine. We don't need to talk about that. Let's assume it's moving. But if it's there for a week and it hasn't moved, maybe we need to talk about that, right? The important thing about aging is that if something starts aging and aging and aging, it's a predictor of its lead time. And the longer it ages, the more likely it's going to be that the lead time is even longer, right? So by all means, look at aging. And then if there is time, talk about the rest of the items, talk about other things that may be happening, but that's it. So yes, focus on aging. At the beginning, probably it's enough to simply bring the awareness around aging, but eventually what you really need to do is to figure out thresholds for aging, right? What are the numbers that will tell you that this thing is too old enough, right? And for that, you need to have a better understanding of your lead time distribution to find where your average is, for example. So if you know that your average for lead time is, let's say your sprint is 10 days and your average is around 7. So most of your items takes half the sprint. Well, the moment something hits 7 days, it means that it's likely it's going to continue and maybe go over, right? But before 7, probably you're fine. So anything that is below 7, nothing to talk about. The moment it hits 7, it means we need to have it front of mind, right? So having some thresholds for aging is probably the important thing. Maybe another threshold is if your sprint is 10 days, if something is above 8 days, we should talk about, or 9 days, because it means you're most likely going to hit it, right? And the numbers are probably off perhaps, but figure out your thresholds for aging. Assuming that this is your goal, right? So if we were saying earlier, sometimes the idea of cadences go out of the window. Now, in terms of other metrics, I think Scrum Masters should be looking at things like cycle times and throughputs and all that. The problem is that those numbers are trailing indicators. They tell you something about work that happened in the past, right? Aging, on the other hand, is a leading indicator. It's a leading indicator of how long things may be blocked, for example. So I would leave those for retrospectives or for service reviews or things like that. Now, customers and stakeholders. that's a question of maturity, because the question is, what are these people going to do with these numbers? It's going back to what Cheezy was saying earlier, right? So if your stakeholders and your business context is such that these things are going to be used to punish people or to guilt them or to bring up some other unhelpful behaviors, then in those contexts, I wouldn't recommend you use too many metrics. But eventually you want to get people into a more quantitative way of understanding work, but you need to raise the maturity first, right? So you need to bring some other values along first before you can start introducing these numbers. Now, once you are there, the advice I would have is that you need to make sure, again, these metrics are about customer recognizable work, right? So if you have decided to have technical stories and little stories that make sense at the team level but not anywhere else, if the stories are so small or so granular that your customers don't really understand them or they don't care about them or whatever it is, showing metrics about that won't help. So you will need to aggregate the work to something that is customer recognizable. So normally with customers, you talk about larger features or capabilities or some objectives. So you need to measure at that level, and then you present metrics for that. So most likely people will want to know how long something will take, right? So as much as we don't like that, people want the answer. So that's a metric that is usually useful. But the key is it needs to be done in customer recognizable terms. So do it at the level of features, for example, not at the level of little stories.
So I'll just have a quick follow up on the customer. I think you're right. I think oftentimes most people want to do. When I said stakeholders, the customers probably do care at the feature level on when things are going to get done. But oftentimes other parts of the org do care about the when. And I know that we can use Monte Carlo analysis to do some forecasting and all that. I just want you to just briefly talk about, because we don't have a lot of time, we want to keep it under like 50 minutes or so, is that what are some of the pitfalls of forecasting? Because I have found that it also requires a great sense of maturity, which a lot of orgs don't have. Because even though when you give an estimate of a particular date, no matter how wrong that date is, no matter how everybody knows that the date is wrong, and everybody knows it's not going to be a realistic thing, it's still a date. It's still a marker in the calendar, which sort of you can plan or get pissed off about whatever you want to do, right? But if you switch to forecasting, you're introducing the ideas of like probability and like, hey, there's an 85% chance you might get done around this date. And maybe it's a cultural thing, but any tips for Scrum Masters or project managers who are now, instead of saying, I'm going to get done on March 1st, are now giving sort of forecasts to management or to VPs or to stakeholders, and any sort of tips or advice that you can offer them before we
So I think it's a very good thing that we are seeing a switch towards this type of estimation rather than the other more good form of estimation we did at the beginning of us. So that's a good thing. Now the bad thing is, or the thing to keep in mind is, you can always do math. It doesn't mean the math will be valid, right? So you can always run your Monte Carlo simulation and put numbers in a formula. That always works. It doesn't mean the number is actually something you can rely on. The two things to look at is, if you're trying to forecast, usually this is used to forecast a batch of work, like a project or a large project or a product where there is an aggregation of things. So if you're going to forecast a batch, the Monte Carlo you run is going to be mostly invalid or unreliable if the variability of single items is too wide. Right? So you need to look at your lead time distribution. If your lead time distribution is too extreme, meaning that it has a very, very long tail, right? If that happens, then the aggregation you do when you do a Monte Carlo simulation is going to be unreliable. So that's one thing. So you need to essentially get your distribution of single items under control before you can start using Monte Carlo. That's one. But the other thing is, even if you do that, the biggest risk for project timelines is not that. The biggest risk is something in the Kanban community sometimes we call dark matter expansion. Right? So dark matter expansion means what we normally...
That's going to be the episode title, by the way, guys. Dark matter expansion. Okay.
Yeah. It's essentially scope creeps, but it's not really scope creep. So you know how dark matter works in astronomy, right? Is this matter that is around the universe that we know is there or we can't see. But our models predicts is there, we know is there, it's just we cannot see it. Same thing. So many of the things we call scope creep is not really scope creep. It's lots of things that, we think we understand the feature, but we don't really understand it until we actually do it. We need to run experiments to figure out things. We need to get feedback to understand what's needed. And so there are lots of things, lots of requirements, lots of work that needs to be done that is there. It was there all the time. We just couldn't see it. It expands. So you need to start looking at how your work expands, and you can look at your past work to get an idea of your dark matter expansion factor, if you'd like. Right? So your biggest risk for forecasting actually has to do with that, right? So if you can do something to contain that, to understand how it works in your context, that has a lot to do with how well you understand your domain, how much technical debt you have, right? So let's go back to the more technical things that have to do with continuous delivery. You deliver your product, and then you find that your delivery pipeline to actually put it in place requires 25 million approvals that will take 25 million years. So that's the risk, really, right? So there are many other things that could be said about forecasting, but those are the two things to keep in mind. One, look for the distribution of your lead time, understand that, and get it under control, especially if you see very, very extreme numbers. Remember that your lead time distribution may show a bunch of numbers that are actually looking okay-ish, and then you have this long tail with a very odd number that we call an outlier, but it's not. Those are the surprises, right? So if your tail is too long, then your forecasting most likely is going to be unreliable. And the other is dark matter expansion. So understand in your domain, in your problem, with your team, how work tends to expand because of things you don't know, right? So what are the process steps or the process countermeasures you need to introduce so that you minimize that? That may mean, for example, running more experiments. That may mean more doing, going back to continuous delivery, doing more small deployments so that you get feedback sooner because you're running, I don't know, experiments with some portion of your market or something like that, right?
Okay, so Fernando, thank you so much for joining us today and illuminating us on a lot of these topics.
Thank you so much
for a more specific discussion on some metrics, and we'll review some charts and all. But I think for now, we'll just keep it sort of at this level and invite you back to dive deeper into some of the CFDs and aging charts and throughput analysis and all that stuff. So thank you again for your time.
Thank you for having me. That was great.
Listener, thank you for joining us, and we'll be back soon enough. Won't give a date, but we'll be back. Thanks for listening.